Hi, my name is Kevin Doran and I'm happy to present our work, Spike Distance Function as a Learning Objective for Spike Prediction. So firstly, a quick overview of our project. In the context of event prediction, it is common to train neural networks using the Poisson learning objective. We are presenting an alternative. We are proposing a representation where each time step is labeled with its distance in time to the nearest event. Neural networks can be trained to approximate this representation, and it can act as a learning objective that has many advantages over the Poisson objective. Okay, let's jump into some details. The event data we are working with is spike responses of retinal ganglion cells from frog and chicken retinas. The retinas are stimulated above with a 4-LED pseudo-random stimulus for 20 minutes. The spike responses of multiple retinal ganglion cells are recorded on a multi-electrode array. On the top here, you can see the responses of a single cell. We want to train neural network models that allow us to predict the spiking behavior of individual cells. At evaluation time, models will not have access to the ground truth spikes. They will have access to stimulus and spike history only. Spikes will be inferred for an interval of the future, and this process will be repeated auto-regressively to generate a single long spike train. Retinal prosthetics is an example of an application where being able to do this task well is very important. In our project, to quantify performance, the outputted spike train will be compared to the ground truth spike train using a number of off-the-shelf spike train comparison metrics. One metric we use is Schreiber similarity, which can be understood as the cosine similarity between the smooth spike trains. We also report the Van Rossum distance, which can be understood as the Euclidean distance between the smooth spike trains. These metrics both have a smoothing parameter, and we will consider performance over a wide range of values for these parameters. I know I'm brushing over these ideas briefly, but the main thing to recognize is that we are evaluating models based on their ability to predict spike trains. So that's how we evaluate models. How do we train them? Well, a standard approach would be to train a neural network to take as input a window of history and to predict the number of spikes that will occur within a fixed time interval of the future. Commonly, a single number is outputted that parameterizes a Poisson distribution over the spike counts. It's often interpreted as the neuron's firing rate, and training the model amounts to maximizing the likelihood of the data with respect to this time-varying parameter. This approach is the baseline we will compare against. Now, as our evaluation metrics work with spike trains, we must infer spikes from spike counts. How do we do it? Well, at inference time, we first infer a spike count and then place that many spikes in the interval. The Poisson distribution corresponds to uniform random placement of these spikes. However, in our tests, we tile the spikes evenly over the interval, as this performs better in terms of the evaluation metrics we are using. When working with spike counts, the interval length over which spikes are summed is a hyperparameter that impacts training and inference. The desire to have predictions with high temporal resolution encourages the choice of a shorter summation interval. Now, how short do you want to go? Well, chicken retinal ganglion cells have been shown to have inter-spike intervals as low as 1 to 2 milliseconds. And in terms of jitter, a number of studies on various animals has observed cells that reliably spike in response to stimulus with a jitter as low as 1 to 2 milliseconds. Now, there is a trade-off associated with selecting interval length. With long intervals, we lose the ability to precisely locate spikes. And on the other hand, as the interval is shortened, training slows as the dataset gets diced into smaller pieces. And at inference time, 0 spikes can become the most likely outcome for all intervals. To illustrate this last issue, I'm going to walk through a bit of a toy example. So imagine there is an input motif that reliably triggers a single spike. And when exactly, we don't know, but let's say the spike will appear somewhere within this gray interval with uniform probability. Now, this motif has been observed many times in the training data, and we want to associate with it a spike count probability distribution. The frequency distribution will depend on the length of the summation interval we are working with. Let's say the interval is as large as the gray interval. Then the frequency distribution of spike counts will be concentrated at one spike. If the interval length is halved, the frequency distribution is now split between 0 and 1 spikes, and further subdivision causes the distribution to shift towards 0 spikes. If you know the frequency distribution and you want to perform inference by selecting the most likely spike count, there is a problem. At sufficiently short intervals, you will always reach a point where the spike count with the highest probability will be 0. Maybe you will say then, well, just choose the correct interval length and things will be fine. This may help with this very specific motif, but across the dataset, the level of uncertainty can vary. For example, a single cell can respond reliably with low jitter to one stimulus and unreliably to another. When training models to predict spike counts, things are even harder, as we don't know beforehand what level of uncertainty is present in the data, and we'd have to test out a range of interval lengths. Finally, you might come back and say, okay, we're not going to use the mode of the distribution for inference. We will sample from the distribution. And switching to sampling means that the inference becomes stochastic, and you can end up predicting values that are not very likely. And here's a chance to talk about the Poisson distribution or issues about using it. The Poisson distribution is shown here for a range of its parameter values. And its rigid and broad shape means that it's not possible to concentrate the distribution around any particular spike count. So for example, if you wish to express confidence in the count of 1 spikes, the highest probability that can be assigned to a spike count of 1 is 36.8%. And when it takes on this value, the spike count of 0 also has a probability of 36.8%. You could have an all-knowing oracle of a model that knows exactly where every spike will be, and you then force it to output its prediction as a Poisson distribution from which you then sample. You're losing all of your predictive power. To make these arguments a little bit more concrete, I'm going to show some snippets of predictions using the Poisson approach. So here a convolutional neural network has been trained with a Poisson learning objective with various summation interval lengths. We're trained once for each length. And at inference time, the most likely spike count, the mode of the distribution, the mode of the outputted Poisson distribution is selected, and that number of spikes are tiled evenly over the output interval. As can be seen, as the interval length is reduced, the 0 spikes becomes the preferred prediction. This effect can be somewhat ameliorated by switching to the mean of the outputted Poisson distribution, or the median, both of which are at least larger than the mode, and we can reach shorter intervals before the rounding to 0 effect is as noticeable. When switching to sampling, we see a very different story. We don't see the same shift towards 0 spikes for shorter intervals, but we do see a lot of variability associated with sampling. And a lot of spike counts are quite different than the value outputted by the model, the predicted distribution mean. So hopefully this gives you a taste of the issues and trade-offs associated with binning and the use of the Poisson distribution. And what if we were to go back to the drawing board? When using the binned counts, a small change to the spike's position could have either no effect on the loss signal if it moves within the same bin, or a large effect if it crosses the bin boundary. Instead, we would like a representation that changes proportionally to changes in spike patterns. Additionally, while the binned approach compressed spike information to a single number, we really want a representation that can capture the temporal structure in detail. We also want a representation that does not hinder a model from expressing strong confidence in any specific spike pattern. And our proposal, the spike distance function, is a representation that meets these criteria. So here I'm finally at the point where I can introduce the spike distance function. Consider this interval And in this interval, there are 4 spikes represented by the dashed lines. The spike distance function assigns to each time step in this interval the time elapsed since the last spike or the time remaining until the next spike, whichever is less. This is an implicit representation of a set of spikes using contours. Any interval can support a spike distance function, and this function can depend on spikes both inside and outside the interval. A neural network can output an array of numbers as an approximation to a spike distance function, and we can create a loss signal by taking the distance between these 2 signals. From a model's output, we can also infer spike times. In the paper, we go into more detail, but we present an inference algorithm which intuitively can be understood as placing spikes in the troughs of the outputted approximation to the distance function. To know more about this, I really encourage you to check out the paper. So let's utilize this representation for the spike prediction task. So where previously we output a single number, now we will output an array of numbers representing the predicted spike distance. And from this, we can infer spike times. So yeah, by placing the spikes in the troughs. Here is a snippet I showed before of the Poisson predictions when sampling is used. And included is the output of another model, this time trained to approximate a spike distance function. The spikes inferred from this output are also shown, and while not perfect, the model does amazingly well at capturing the temporal structure of the spikes. All right, now that was just a snippet. Here we have one of the metrics I introduced before, Schreiber similarity, evaluated over the whole test set for all cells. The Schreiber similarity is evaluated for a range of its smoothing parameters, which is what you see on the x-axis. In this case, all Poisson models are using the mode for spike prediction. The spike distance model easily outperforms all of these, really. From the earlier discussion, we would expect that the performance of the Poisson models to improve, or would improve, by switching to inference using the distribution mean. And and this is what we see in the second figure. It's noteworthy that no single Poisson model performs best across all smoothing parameters. And again, we have the distance model outperforming all of them. Finally, when using sampling, the distance between, or the difference between the different Poisson models is much less pronounced. However, the spike distance model still outperforms in this case. And I want to briefly mention 2 other metrics that we report. And for these, the distance approach maintains its advantage over the Poisson approach. Okay, so I've sped through a lot of things. There are a lot more details in the paper, more results, more formalism, more discussion. Please check it out. If anyone has any questions, please come find me at the poster session or send me an email. Thank you.